Casio brings us some amazing games because they take place in a maze. I'm proud to have been the first person ever to have come up with this joke on NES Works Gaiden Casio.
A bullet lets you know it's there a lot faster than cancer, Mike.
It's the end of an era. The very last Konami release for Casio PV-1000. Really puts a lump in the old throat, you know?
Turpin on PV-1000 makes for an interesting counterpart to Frogger for Gawkin TV Boy. The two games share something of a similar background. Konami created both Turpin and Frogger, and Sega published them. In fact, that's where the name Turpin hails from. It shipped under the name Turtles for machines manufactured for Konami by Stern, you know, the guys who distributed Scramble and Super Cobra in America, and Turpin for machines by Sega. In short, in the US, Stern sold it as Turtles, and in Japan, Sega pitched it as Turpin. So you may already know this game. Turpin, of course, is not a real word. It appears to be a corruption or portmanteau of turtles and terrapin, which actually are words, but which would have been a lot harder to trademark than a botched-together neologism. Smart move, Sega. But however you know the game, Turtles' lineage leaves you with the impression that it mostly coasted on the goodwill of Frogger and dreams by licensors of getting their hands on another Frogger-sized super hit. Or maybe it was just the we have Frogger at home substitute that smaller licensors had to settle for. Consider, both games involve closely related water-based critters, an amphibian in Frogger and an amphibious reptile in Turpin, who have to scurry past hazards in search of home. Frogger took on a life of its own, appearing on tons of popular consoles and as a standalone mini-machine. The major players all had their own version of Frogger, every system ranging from the Atari consoles and computers to Intellivision to TV Boy. Meanwhile, Turpin only made its way home for the Weirdo systems. The most popular device to play host to Turpin was Magnavox's Odyssey 2, which didn't exactly set the world on fire, Casey Munchkin notwithstanding. No, really, Turpin always showed up on the also-rans, like Tomy Puta, Intex Adventure Vision, and PV-1000. It really does seem like a budget-rate Konami Sega license, the one you could afford if you had Frogger aspirations and a Tutankhamun budget. I realize it probably sounds like I'm treading water here, not unlike a turtle, but to be honest, there's not that much to say about Turpin. It lacks the incisive sense of vision that Frogger did. That game had a simple, creative concept that you could easily grasp, get the frog to the homes, but which featured a slew of complications that actually made achieving that goal difficult. That's not really the case for Turpin. It's yet another one of the countless maze chase games to have sprung up in the wake of Pac-Man. That in itself is no flaw. Pac-Man inspired a lot of pretty interesting maze chases. We've seen them here on this channel. Games like Lock and Chase, Sinbad Mystery, and Clue Land. They're good, fun, fresh, and inventive. Turpin doesn't quite hit those marks. It's fine, sure, but it's mechanically sparse and stifling. Or maybe creatively sparse and mechanically stifling. Either way, I don't love it. Turpin places you in the role of a mother turtle who has to transport her children safely home. Home in this case means literally a small house that pops up randomly in one corner of the screen. And her children somehow hatch not from eggs, but rather from question mark icons, and they need to escape predation from large beetles. I know it's video game logic and imagery, but you do get the sensation that the creators didn't make too much effort to come up with a cohesive thematic premise compared to other Konami titles of the era, such as Tutankhamun Puyan. So it works like this. You grab a baby from a question block which disappears once hatched. You could only tote around a single turtle hatchling at a time, and you need to make a beeline toward the turtle house in order to deposit the child safely away from the gigantic, roaming insects that have evidently decided to make mini turtles their favored gourmet fare. While lugging her young burden, the mother turtle moves more slowly on straightaways than the beetles do, though she corners a bit more deftly. Basically, the more time you spend dragging a child around, the greater the likelihood that a beetle will devour you or your baby or whatever it is that causes you to lose a life upon colliding with a bug. So it behooves you to book it to the house. This becomes more difficult as you advance into the later stages, and the beetles grow in numbers and speed alike. Unfortunately, you only have a single defense against the beetles besides dexterous fingerwork. You can collect a shining star that spawns occasionally in the middle of the maze. The star icon doesn't do anything when you touch it, but it does add up in your little turtle inventory. The stars, it turns out, are landmines? You can press the action button to drop a star mine behind you. If a beetle bumbles into the bomb you've placed, it will become stunned and freeze in place for several seconds, allowing you to pass it safely and get about your business. However, it only buys a temporary reprieve, and the beetle will soon return to its marauding ways. But I suppose it's better than nothing, which I suppose describes Turpin in a nutshell. Not great, but technically better than nothing. As far as turtle-based Konami games go, I'd rank Turpin way down there. Give me TMNT for NES any day of the week. I don't care if TMNT is ridiculously difficult, it's still more entertaining than this snooze fest.
Konami may be gone, but our next PV-1000 release sticks firmly to the maze chase genre, making it a sort of spiritual kindred to Turpin. It's also spiritual kindred to Konami's Super Cobra, because the name Fighting Bug masks a much more familiar title, Ladybug.
Comparing and contrasting Fighting Bug against Turpin offers an interesting exercise in game design. Here we have two maze chase games that involve a little critter being chased through quarters by hungry bugs, warding them off with fixed hazards, and one is a bangin' classic while the other is not. I've already spoiled the surprise of the identity as to which is which, I'm afraid. As you may be aware, I don't really think too highly of Turpin. Fighting Bug, on the other hand, stands out as one of the highlights of the PV-1000 library. Admittedly, this amounts to a rather small field in which to excel, but who could complain about standing in the company of quiet greats like Tutankhamun and, let me check my notes here, Pachinko UFO? Huh. Well, anyway, Ladybug has that special magic that makes a great arcade game from the early 1980s and turns what could have been yet another Pac-Man wannabe into something that stands on its own. Ladybug, or Fighting Bug if you will, has a simple premise that quickly escalates into a manic, panic-inducing challenge thanks to its speed and the emergent complexity of its design. In less academic terms, it does a lot with a little. Or to put it even more simply, it's real good. And really, who would expect anything less? Ladybug is the debut work of one Kazutoshi Ueda, whose name you may not recognize, but whose legacy you absolutely will. Ueda would follow up on Ladybug with Mr. Do, another Namco knockoff that arguably plays better than the work it's derived from, and then bailed on Universal in order to create his own studio, an obscure little nothing of a development house called Atlus. Ueda worked on quite a few of Atlus's early games, including Dungeon Explorer and Megami Tensei 2, but for my money, his work never quite hit the highs of Ladybug. I mean, Atlus as a whole has made some genuine all-timers, but Ueda seemingly got tricked into management and had to shuffle papers and make decisions about where corporate resources should be allocated in return for a big paycheck, instead of getting to do actual fun things like toil away making video games. The fool. But hey, we'll always have Ladybug, a game that made its way to a handful of consoles in the early age of video games. Here you can see the quality of the game reflected through licensing. Where Turpin showed up on failed and low-appeal consoles, Ladybug held itself over for the key systems in the briefly bustling US market, Intellivision and ColecoVision. As a matter of fact, Coleco treated Ladybug as a marquee title, giving it nearly as much promotion as Pac-Man Donkey Kong. So here we have another case of Casio using its clout to buff up its doomed console to an impressive, if futile, shine. The PV-1000 version of Ladybug holds up pretty favorably to the vaunted Coleco port. Admittedly, its fairly rudimentary visuals don't require a lot of juice, and it does move far more choppily than the Coleco rendition, but the game plays, so far as I, admittedly not a Ladybug pro, can tell, faithfully to the arcade original. Ladybug stands out from other Pac-Man clones due to its largely passive nature. A key feature of Pac-Man, and thus of games that wanted to taste a sweet slice of that hit's 25-cent returns, was that players spent most of the game on their back foot. While trying to control the maze by eating dots or painting corridors or whatever, the protagonists of these games found themselves largely helpless in the face of the monsters or bugs or various other hungry hostile forces that pursued them. But invariably, the game would make available some sort of collectible power-up that gave the player the ability to briefly go on the offensive, be it an Energizer pellet or a flamethrower. Even Turpin gave the Lady Turtle landmines, an authentic treatment of herpetological biology if ever there was one. Fighting Bug does not offer even that nicety. As your little beetle scurries around the maze, you can't use weapons of any sort. The maze does contain a selection of bug-killing poison pellets that appear at random at the beginning of each level, and you can use these to knock out pursuing bad guys. However, you have no control over the initial placement of poison, and you can't actually manipulate its placement during gameplay. All you can do is try to steer your enemies into it, which will kill them and cause a replacement to spawn in the bug house in the center of the screen. These elements were clearly derived from Pac-Man, but they impose much tighter limits on the player as they try to clear the maze of Pac-Man-style dots. As does the maze itself, which consists of thinner, more dynamically arranged lines than the stages in Namco's game, making for a denser maze and faster pursuit. That's not all that makes Fighting Bug's maze action distinct, though. Your avatar may not have the ability to fight directly against your enemies, but you have the unique ability to evade them by manipulating the maze itself. Certain panels of the maze show up in different colors than the rest of the environment. You can flip these panels 90 degrees in order to change the layout of the maze on the fly, closing off one path while creating another. Fighting Bug hangs on this mechanic, which leads to narrow escapes and desperate gambits as you attempt to rewire the maze to shut the door on a predator nipping at your 6 tiny heels. Each maze was designed carefully to make it impossible for you to completely block yourself away from pursuers. No matter how you move the walls, you'll always be vulnerable from at least one direction. So you need to stay on the move, never resting for too long. Even deflecting a pursuer into smashing into a poison pill doesn't offer much respite. A replacement bug spawns almost instantaneously in the center of the maze, which might give you a brief breather, but forces you to recalculate possible new lines of attack against you. Worse, enemy bugs will sometimes zip recklessly into poison pills for no particular reason, something that seems much more likely to happen when you're close to the center of the screen than at its periphery. That is to say, they seemingly off themselves deliberately in order to put themselves closer to you, putting you in greater danger, and forcing you to switch up your tactics. It's a great game. Fighting Bug features a lot of the same ideas as Exidy's Mousetrap, which debuted in arcades around the same time, at the end of 1981, but it presents them far more elegantly. Unlike in Mousetrap, you don't need to fuss with an array of differently colored buttons, allowing you to focus entirely on a single button and the more intense action and faster pacing. And Casio's programmers, or whichever unknown work-for-hire Ghost developer ported this game to PV-1000, did an excellent job with the conversion. I'd say that Fighting Bug is almost worth owning a PV-1000 for, except that you can get the ColecoVision console and Ladybug cartridge for a tiny fraction of the going price for this setup. But as the sole Japanese home release for the game, it's probably the closest thing the PV-1000 had to a killer app in its home territory.
Next time on NES Works Gaiden Casio, it's pachinko, but don't panic.